Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson, and I'm here with B'nai Lepi, as always, for this week's episode of the Oral Talmud. Hey, B'nai.
Hey Dan, how are you?
I'm good, and we are here at our new time, or our new temporary time, which means that my hair is wet,
Mine
and
too.
we're kind of getting I was gonna say, like, as painful as it might be for you to watch this show 2 hours earlier than usual, it's painful for us, but no, it's good. And folks who are sort of surprised that this just popped up on Facebook and are expecting it in 2 hours, you could come back in 2 hours and watch it then when it's more convenient for you. So anyway, we're here for a couple of months at this hour at least, for scheduling reasons, but we're happy to be here at any time. So B'nai, today, so just a couple, I mean, we have some fun, great guests coming up starting next week, so we're really excited about that. We have a constitutional law professor coming on to talk with us about constitutions and interpretation of constitutions and comparing that to the Talmud, so we're really excited about that. And then we have some more Talmud scholars coming up, so it'll be great. And we're going to continue studying these texts interspersed with those. So today we have a text that is from the tractate of Ketubot 104a, and it is the story that pertains to the death of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who I just want to say a couple of words of introduction about him, because I'll say this. I don't know that I said this. I probably did early on in the show, but I translated a novel by Yochi Brandis, who's an Israeli novelist. It's called The Orchard, and it's about the early rabbis of Yavne. And for me, as someone who had studied Talmud before, it was transformational to read that book and translate that book, because all of a sudden these names, which I would like skip over the names usually. You're like so-and-so said in the name of so-and-so, and then they said something, and you would read what the thing that they said. And somehow the names were just such a jumble and so confusing. And you were just kind of like, well, that's just filler. And then when I read the novel, and I understood, like, she was tying together this, Rabbi Eliezer says this over here and says this over here, and actually those actually are aligned. They make sense, and so then it's actually important to know who Rabbi Eliezer was. It was just changed everything for me, and it gave me a sense of like these people as characters in a story that were playing a role, and maybe that role is historical, and maybe that role is just, okay, who is Rabbi Eliezer supposed to symbolize in the Talmudic landscape, it may be that it's like poorly written, poorly edited, in that doesn't like pop off on its own, right? I mean, you could argue, or you could argue that I was a bad reader, and they actually are bending over backwards to constantly be telling you which character is saying what, right? So in any event, I'll just note that that experience was so transformational for me that I actually neglected in the translation to suggest something which other readers then suggested, which would have been a great idea, which would have been to include a kind of glossary of who's who in the book. And my experience had been, oh, I don't need that, because that's exactly what the book is doing for me. But I didn't realize that others who hadn't already kind of been familiar with these kind of names, even though they didn't really know who they were, that they would have been encountering these people for the first time and would have had that same sense of confusion, like, who is this? Because their name all starts with rabbi, so it was like very confusing to people, right? But anyway, so do you have something to say about that? And then we can talk about
Yeah, well, here on my desk, I always have my who's who, that gives some stories and background. This one was poor. This one, almost starved because he was sitting on the roof, and in the wintertime, he almost froze while he was needing to, listen to I wish it had pictures, although after reading your book or your translation of The Orchard, I now have a picture of Rabbi Akiva in my head that I can't get out of my head.
Right.
But you're right. I think if you think that the editor of the Talmud assumed you were going to learn the whole thing, you actually can put together a sense of their personalities when you read, oh, Rabbi Zera, I know Rabbi Zera. He was the one who used to walk in front of the home of someone who had hurt him before Yom Kippur. Oh, I have a sense of what kind of guy he was. I just learned about him last night in another. But it takes a lot of attention to put together the personality profile, or to imagine who they are.
And by the way, like, that book that you held up, who's who in the Talmud, is that what it's called? I think it's extremely expensive. Like I think I tried to like get it and I was like, oh, I'm not paying that.
It is
And,
about $50.
oh, I thought it was more. That's
It
expensive,
could be
but it's
more
not
now.
terrible.
Yeah.
But there are other books too. There's a series of books by Benny Lau called The Sages, and that's a little bit more. It's not just biographies, but and then there's a bunch of others. You're holding up one, or that's a
Yeah,
Hebrew.
yeah, it's a Hebrew one. Yeah, there are a bunch.
Yeah, there are a bunch. There's one called The Sages. There's another. There are a
Yeah.
bunch of them, and I would suggest that for folks who are getting into Talmud learning, it's worth getting one of those. It's a really helpful reference, and as is just studying Talmud, I remember we were doing the daily Talmud page of Daf Yomi, and there's this whole thing about Rav Papa. I forget which tractate it's in, maybe Brachot, and that he was kind of like a bumbling sort of guy or something like that. And that was like striking to me because what the sort of refrain that you say when you complete a tractate has to do with Rav Papa and all his descendants. So in some way, he's like an important guy, but he's kind of like not talked about that respectfully in this part at least. So there's all kinds of interesting things that lens can give you. So just about Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi here, just to set this the stage for this text that we're going to study. He had a, so first of all, I'll just note in the Orchard, I really don't want to give any spoilers, but he actually has a significant character in the Orchard, although he's not actually in most of the book, but it is sort of arguably about Yehuda Hanassi. So I'll tease that for readers out there. He is the person who's sort of famous in the world. You know, if you know who Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is, you know that he's the person known to be the compiler of the Mishnah. What that means exactly, a little bit unclear, because the Mishnah was oral for a long time, even after that quote compilation. It wasn't like he sat down and wrote a book, but he somehow decided what was going to be elevated to this category of the Mishnah, this important sort of collection of laws and practices. And that's his kind of, from a professional standpoint, that was basically be his professional biography. You talk about how you have this imagining of him, that he was like living at this time where maybe people are starting to forget things, or it was kind of a little chaotic, and he was just running around the northern Galilee and just asking people like, what do you do, what do you do, what do you do, you know, and then he was kind of deciding what was the best stuff, and he said, well, we're going to put this in this Mishnah.
Yeah, he really created the new canon.
Mm-hmm.
And as who is it that wrote the new canon just last year? Was it Yehuda Kurtzer
and Claire Sifrin?
Right. I imagine they're both. I imagine they're getting pushback from calling their book the new canon. They talk about that a little bit, and I imagine Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi also was getting some pushback, because he was saying, of all the things we do, in all the variety of ways we do them, this is going to be the official way to be Jewish. So right. That was a pretty bold move on his part.
Yeah, and I'm thinking. Oh, go ahead.
And I think that's the right thing to do periodically. And I happen to think we're in another time when it's probably time, to make this bold declaration. This is the shape of Judaism that I propose. And some of it's old stuff, and some of it's tweaked stuff, and some of it's new stuff we're trying out and we hope is going to take, and stuff that we do just because we're American. But I think it's time for another, this is it. And let's not pay so much attention to all the other stuff, because traditions get too big and too complicated, and you forget what it's really about and what the core foundational principles and values are. I think we need a new restatement.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I am of two minds about it. I on the one hand, I think that, and on the other hand, I'm just thinking to our conversation with Menachem Fish and thinking about that the real authentic Talmudic Judaism is one that doesn't resolve things. And yet there's also, but I've been holding that for weeks now, and I've been thinking about, it's on the one hand, it's true that the Talmud in its sort of purest form is trying not to decide matters of controversy, but it's also kind of drawing lines or reaffirming lines, or like you say, a restating lines that kind of have emerged already, and that nobody, at least in their corner of the world, is disputing. And so it's so that's actually is deciding a lot of things. It's actually we could maybe in a future week we should call in a critical legal studies scholar, because I think there's a lot of work today in the legal academy that's kind of about that. It's about, you know, on the one hand making a distinction between the really controversial matters where you can't necessarily resolve them from within the system, but there's still a world of matters that society more or less agrees upon, or at least, like I say, the part of society that you really want to be writing for. And there you actually are defining, okay, this is who we are. And so, and by the way, like I've actually been thinking about that a lot in terms of our time too, saying like, is this a, actually I was in a meeting recently to say, is this a Yavna moment? And in our time today. And one of the things that I said, I think there's nuance to this, and I'm not sure I totally agree with what I said, but I said that if the temple, the predicate for the Yavna moment is that the temple was destroyed and that the temple form of Judaism was destroyed. If you believe that rabbinic Judaism has been destroyed, you know, or is on the process of being destroyed, and I don't mean destroyed, collapsing, however you want to say it, then it could be a Yavna moment. But if you don't believe that rabbinic Judaism is on the decline, then it's not a Yavna moment by definition. So don't call it that. Let's not call everything a Yavna moment. If it's a Yavna moment, that means we're saying that the previous form of Judaism is not going to be the future form of Judaism. And most people aren't willing to admit that.
Right.
And so it's not a Yavna moment. I think so.
Until you're ready to declare that over.
Right.
You know what that reminds me of? I'm in this wonderful program that April Baskin and others are doing called Whiteness Chavruta, produced by her Joyous Justice organization. And one of the ideas that came up in one of our sessions last week was that you can't have PTSD until the trauma is over. Uh-huh. Right? Like if the trauma is exactly, you can't be post-traumatic until the trauma is over. And if the trauma is still going on, you can't even begin to deal with PTSD. Uh-huh. So it's like what you're saying. It's like you can't have a Yavna moment until you declare that the former form of Judaism is over. That's a necessary condition to the reframing, the healing, the dealing with the new.
Right. And now if it is a Yavna moment, and by the way, maybe that we should just have a conversation about this at some point, like without a text, like just to think this through. But if it is a Yavna moment, then you say, okay, who's going to Yavna? And what's interesting, now I'm going back to the characters question, because the characters that we have that went to Yavna range from, you know, the radical Rabbi Meir, or, you know, to the conservative Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Eliezer. And then on the one hand, you have Elisha ben Avuya, also called Acher, who is a radical, and then he gets too radical, and he's kind of out on the one end, on the radical, he's too radical for Yavna. And then you end up with Rabbi Eliezer getting excommunicated because it turns out that he's too conservative, right? And so on the one hand, you have this group who says at the beginning point, yeah, we believe that Temple Judaism is over and we're going to Yavna. But then it turns out that on both ends of the group, it's actually not right. And so it is important to sort of understand who these characters are and why it ended up not right for them. And then you end up with even Rabbi Akiva, who's one of the more radical voices that ends up supporting the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is an attempt to kind of try to get back to the old version, right? I mean, the whole idea of Bar Kokhba is eventually to rebuild the temple again and go back to that. So even the radical Rabbi Akiva, you see to some extent is actually not quite done with Temple Judaism. And so, you know, then maybe even a Yavna moment isn't really the moment. And really the moment is after the Bar Kokhba revolt. You know, we could call that Usha, which was another city where some of the things were happening, or a Babylon moment, or whatever it might be. And you know, when we use this terminology, I'm saying two different things, but they're connected. One is when we use this terminology, and these metaphors and analogies, let's actually understand what we're really talking about. And number two is that it is a good reason to understand these characters, because a lot of these characters are like characters in our day. There are people like these, you could say, like, who today, B'nai Lepi, she's like, you know, Rabbi Akiva, you know, so-and-so is more like Rabbi, but, you know,
I'll take that.
Well, you know, anyway, but so it's helpful. It's helpful. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, so he's.
Hey, well, let me just add one thing about the Yavna moment question. Just as I came to realize that the crash moment isn't a moment, but is preceded by a long period of crumble, I think the Yavna moment is also a span of time that there's a moment of beginning And then there's a moment of, okay, this really is it. There's no going back. And I think it was 2,000 years ago, between the beginning of folks, while the temple was standing, saying, I just don't believe this anymore. It's just not how I believe what I think God wants, up until there's no temple, it's no longer possible, and we've now given up trying to make that happen again. So I think the Yavna moment is really a Yavna span. Yeah.
Well, okay, good. And so Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is an interesting character because, in a sense, he represents that span. Because so he, right, as the compiler of the Mishnah, in a way, he is the last rabbi of the pre-Mishnah era, right? And he's the first rabbi of the post-Mishnah, or what we could call the Talmudic era, arguably. He is also the lineal descendant of Hillel the Elder. That's Hillel of Hillel and Shammai, right? And Hillel the Elder lived in the time of the temple. He lived in the time of Herod, and Herod is the person who built what we call the late second temple. I mean, in a sense, it was the third temple. He had actually raised the second temple to the ground, actually raised the mountain, rebuilt the mountain, and put a new, Roman style, more beautiful temple there. Hillel was alive during this period where Herod is building this fancy temple, and Hillel is basically, arguably, a dissident. I mean, he's one of these early guys it's crumbling for him. He may or may not actually be in favor of that. Does he want it to end, to be destroyed? Certainly not. But does he want it to end? I mean, maybe he sees it coming. Anyway, he's, arguably, again, one of the founders of what we now understand to have become Rabbinic Judaism. He's an enormously important figure in the Talmud. And so his lineal line of descent is, his son is named Shimon ben Hillel, Simon the son of Hillel. His son is Gamliel the first. His son is Shimon ben Gamliel the first. His son is Gamliel the second. His son is Shimon ben Gamliel the second, and his son is Yehuda Hanasi. And so I don't know what that makes it great, but what that means is that, and Yehuda Hanasi, could get translated different ways, but a Nasi was kind of the person in charge. Sometimes it gets translated as the prince, but it doesn't mean the prince like we think it's like the father is a king. But in this particular case, it's not so clear that it's not a prince in that way. You could think of him a little bit as a prince in the sense of that he comes from probably the most yichus, what do you call that? Like the most
well-connected or
elite family in the rabbinic world. And so he's lineal descendant of that, and his job is, his office is this top guy, right? And so this is a very, very significant guy, no matter which direction if you look at a more progressive, okay, this is the guy that started the Mishnah, but if you look at a more conservative way, well, this is the guy who was for 200 years, his family was the top family in the place, right? So this is very, very top guy. Say more about that.
Cool. I learned more about Yehuda Hanasi than I ever knew from you right now. Thank you.
All right, good. So let's jump into the text. So he's on his deathbed, or he's very sick.
He's on his deathbed, and there are a few reasons why I love this text. I just want to say why this text for a moment before we jump in. And I think there are three reasons. One is we're moving to this text because kind of in this arc that we're working out as we, have our discussions each week, we're at the point at which we have seen how Svara works when it's named. We've seen how it works when it's so screamingly obvious it's at play, like with the Wayward and Rebellious Son, even though it's not named. But now we're into examples of Svara working when it's very subtle, and in an attempt to help us all develop Svara eyeglasses so that we can see it working in the tradition for, in my mind, the ultimate goal of gaining confidence that we stand on a tradition that wants us to use our svara, and so that we can identify our svara and go, oh, that's actually a legitimate source. That's a legitimate thing to lead with. If it seems to disagree with the tradition as it's come down to me, I don't have to either take it or leave it, the tradition, and leave. I can do what, the rabbis did, which is take my svara and critique, destabilize, upgrade the tradition. So this is an example of svara working in a very subtle way, but once you learn how to see it, you can see it. Next, it's a text where the star of the show is a woman, and I think that's significant. And finally, it is one of the go-to texts for anyone doing Jewish medical ethics. And we've already learned about the concept of pikuach nefesh, this mandate to overturn any law in the Torah with 3 exceptions in order to save a life or prevent harm to a life. This is the text at the other end of the spectrum on medical ethics questions, and I don't want to give it away. You will see it when we get there, but it's a very important text for those issues as well.
Okay, so let's jump into it.
Okay.
So it starts here on the day. This is Ketubot 104a. I'm just reminding folks that we have these Sefaria source sheet. We have a running sheet for all our texts that are all on one sheet, but we also have individual source sheets for each episode now with the video there with the source. So there'll be that for this right after the show. Okay, so on the day that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi died, the sages, by the way, the spoiler alert here, but on the day that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi died, the sages decreed a fast and begged for divine mercy so that he would not die. And they said, anyone who says that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi has died will be stabbed with a sword.
I want to say that I've never really understood this line. Are they worried about? It makes sense to me that they'd be worried. Let's not give him a kinahara, right? Let's not cast the evil eye on him. My grandmother very much believed in a kinahara. You couldn't say something bad might happen, or else it might happen. So I totally understand why, from a superstition point of view, they wouldn't want someone to say, oh, he's dying, or it looks like it's close, or he's going to die, lest that might push his death. But this looks like it's saying you can't say he died after he died. I never understood that. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I suppose I would think that it's something along the lines of it could be about like superstition. I think that I think that maybe it suggests to me that the stakes are so high here that they're concerned that if word gets out that he's died, it would cause such panic and such I feel like there's some example that's in my mind that I can't. There was actually something. I mean, I remember that there was something. I mean, this is a much lower stakes kind of thing, but there was something not too long ago where the I can't remember what her name is, but one of the actresses from the show Charlie's Angels, and she was very sick, and Twitter had put the word out that she died, and there a lot of people were really sad and upset, and I think that actually her husband or boyfriend hadn't been told, and he found out from Twitter, and there was a whole thing, and then it turned out that she hadn't died, but then she died the next day, meaning she was actually dying, but there was just something about if somebody is on their deathbed, just kind of stay out of it, just kind of don't, there's a lot at stake here. Let's be very, very careful. Something like that, I don't, it's hard to understand why they would be saying if he actually died.
Yeah, but now that I've raised the question of is it about before or after, now I'm remembering that after this sugya that we're learning today, there are little stories of once he dies, people in a kind of a cagey way saying something to convey that he died without saying he died, after which the listener, the person they're talking to, says, oh my gosh, did he die? and then the person saying, I didn't say it. You know what I mean? So I think they were concerned about saying he died after he died. And maybe it is like what you're saying. If, like, God forbid, a president should die, they probably want to know the game plan of, like, who's in charge, what to reassure, like you say, to reassure people before they know. You know, like what they say in England, don't they say,
long, the queen is dead, long live the queen.
The queen is dead, long live the queen, right? It's like, you don't say one before you say the other way. You don't say you don't have a queen until you also say at the same time, you have a new queen. Maybe it's that. I'm not sure.
Interesting. I mean, it's also, but it's also, I would love to look at those stories. It's also interesting what you're saying, because like maybe there is some kind of superstition. Like, it also, that's making me think of cases where other places in the Talmud, or I'm also even thinking about like the New Testament, where, you know, people come up to Jesus and they say like, are you the Messiah? Are you the Lord? And he says like, I didn't say it, you know, like, right. Or you said it, you know, you said that. And I always remember reading that and I'm like, what is that about? What? So, you know, but maybe like there was some sense of like, that's just sort of not, we don't talk that way, maybe for superstitious reasons, maybe for practical reasons. Interesting.
Yeah, now you're giving me the idea that maybe it is about a certain humility, like it's arrogant in the extreme to name. I don't know. We'll leave this as an open question.
We'll put a sticky on that.
We'll put a sticky there.
All right. So the maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi ascended to the roof and said, the upper ones are requesting Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and the lower ones are requesting Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi.
Yeah. I love this. This is such a visual thing. I can picture her. Okay, so the maidservant is a woman. It's unclear to me whether she's Jewish or not. Lots of maidservants and servants were not Jewish, and it's not unheard of or that uncommon in the Talmud that their teaching becomes the teaching that influences their, you know, master, the rabbi, and then he changes his mind. So I don't know. So she goes up to the roof and she's praying. This is her prayer. And what's going on in the scene is she's talking about the lower ones. What she's talking about, and I think it's Rashi that clarifies it, she's talking about all of the students, disciples, and followers of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. There must have been hundreds of them. That's my imagination. Hundreds or thousands surrounding his home, surrounding his bed, praying that he should live, right? They're probably reciting Psalms, and their hope is that he should not die, right?
Yeah, in the story, that's true. I mean, I think we can think about these like Hasidic funerals and stuff where there's just like, you just imagine, you know, and imagine that probably when the Rebbe is dying, it's similar. In the real case, I think that probably wasn't historically true, right? Like historically, there probably were very few people around him.
Maybe there were a dozen people. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you often say, like, when you're giving a talk, it's the number of rabbis were fewer than the number of people in this room right now, you know, and I think that's right. But it certainly doesn't really matter. In the story, I think that's the image, that there are these huge numbers of people down below, humans, who say, please don't let this man die. We need him. And the heavens, right, the upper ones are saying, essentially, God or the heavenly angels or whoever, you know, right, are saying, like, it's time for this man to come to us,
right?
So there's a tug of war, kind of,
right? There's this tug of war. The angels are sort of pulling Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's soul up. They're sort of saying, yeah, it's time. And the people are saying, no, it's not time, not now. And the handmaiden goes up to the roof and prays to God, and she's saying, let the lower ones who are saying keep him alive, win out over the angels who are saying, hey, it's time.
Yeah, well, you jumped the gun because we didn't read that part yet. But so the maidservant says.
Oh, sorry, I forgot that. Okay.
The maidservant says the upper ones are requesting Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and the lower ones are requesting Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. May it be the will of God that the lower ones should prevail over the upper ones. So so basically what that means is, like, may he live, right? He, like, I just, please let him live. Which, of course, is anybody's prayer when somebody's dying, usually.
Yes, and I think that I think that is the Hava Amina
Mm-hmm.
that this text is speaking to. Okay, so what's a Hava Amina? A Hava Amina is that which you would have said is the right thing to do had you not heard this text.
Mm-hmm.
It's speaking to some common understanding of what's right, and it wants to say, no, what you thought was right isn't right. And lately I've been realizing that a Hava Mina, which we typically understand to mean what you would have erroneously thought was true, actually is what you were right to know was true yesterday.
Mm.
But today is no longer true. I think that is more of how this dynamic works. When a text is saying, you would have thought that thing, but you would have been wrong to think that. The truth is, you would have been right to think that. That was the right thing to do yesterday. We're now changing what we think is right. That's what this moment of this text is. It's a moment saying, you thought that the right thing to do is to pray that somebody live as they're dying.
Mm.
Not necessarily so, as we'll see.
Okay. So, however, when she saw how many times he would enter the bathroom and remove his tefillin and then exit and put them back on, and how he was suffering, and the explanation here is with intestinal disease. So I just want to clarify what this image is about. So in at least, I mean, who knows, but at least in the Talmud's imagination of these rabbis, they would wear tefillin all the time. And that was just sort of part of their, it wasn't just, we think of people who wear tefillin that they only do it when they're going to prayers in the morning. But these are people, the idea here is that people wore tefillin all of the time, the entire day, not at night, but in the day. And if you went to the bathroom, you had to take the tefillin off and hang them on a hook outside. And actually, there's places in the Talmud where there's all kinds of concerns that people might take your tefillin, and that maybe they would even take your tefillin and like set you up as if you visited a prostitute, because they would put the tefillin in the prostitute's house. There's all kinds of like stuff going on with the tefillin here, as if you paid the prostitute with your tefillin, because you didn't have any cash on you and things like that. So there are all kinds of stuff about this, like what bad things could happen when you have left your tefillin unattended because you've hung it up outside the bathroom. But the bottom line here is that a good Jew would wear tefillin all the time and would never wear the tefillin in the bathroom. So if you have an intestinal disease where you have to go to the bathroom all the time, you're constantly putting it on, taking it off, putting it on, taking it off.
Right. And let's remember that your tefillin has klafim. It has parchments with pieces of the Torah written on it. So it's like little pieces of the Torah inside the tefillin, and that can't go into a bathroom or a space that's not clean, just like your talis, right? In a traditional shul, outside of the bathroom, you'll see lots of talises hooked, draped over the banister. People take them off. Okay, yeah. And
they're
Rashi's
the bathroom checking their iPhone, but they're not wearing a talis.
I love that.
Okay.
So what I love about this piece of the text is that didn't everybody else see him also struggling and suffering in pain to unwind his tefillin each time he had to go to the bathroom and put it back on in pain? I love that it's naming the handmaiden as the one. For sure they all saw it, but it's her that said, oh my God, it's in time. I can't stand that he should not be in this kind of pain and suffering. I need to do something to address his pain. And go ahead.
Oh, you go.
It's like every time I see svara at work in a text, I used to think it was only this person who's naming it who saw it, but not the problem, whatever the problem was, whatever the suffering was. I feel quite sure that everyone was aware of the suffering, but it's the person who names it who's saying, and this is intolerable. It can't be God's will that this continue. And I'm willing to overturn what our tradition says is right in order to fix that suffering. And here the person doing that is this woman, is this handmaiden. I think that's beautiful. It doesn't seem surprising to me that all of his students, are around his bed thinking more about he should live than his suffering. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too cynical.
No, I think that, okay, well, so a couple things. One, I think that's a beautiful read. And within that read, I think there are two significant things. One is that she's a woman, and the other, and the rest of the students are all men by definition at that time. And the other one is that she's a maidservant, and the others are like aristocrats. That's the word I was looking for before. Or that they've somehow become, elite. And so they're like, and that it's actually the maidservant, the regular person, the woman
The
who
marginalized person, the one who's
right.
not so caught into the system of it's all, this is what you do, this is what you have to do.
Well, and who sees the humanity of this person who the others see as a role. They see he's our rabbi. She says he's a person who I care for. I see his humanity. They only are seeing what he represents or who he is professionally or to their, and she sees what's true. Ultimately, we're shown that she's right, but that she sees what's true. So I accept your reading. I think it's beautiful. That I was just thinking, and I had put it out as an alternative that's still very similar. It's one that they're not around his bed. They're outside. They actually don't see his suffering. They only know that he's dying, and because they don't see his suffering, they only focus on the loss that they're going to have about his death. And only she, because she's attending to him directly, only she really sees his suffering. And either way, it's, I think, the same takeaway, which is that only she sees him as a person, and that matters. So she sees this terrible suffering that he can't get comfortable. He just is going to the bathroom. We've had that feeling, all of us, at different times, TLDR, but the TMI, but not this sort of like existentially. And she understands that this is just he's just suffering. He's just suffering so much. And she said. So then she says, after she sees how much he's suffering, she says, "May it be the will of God that the upper ones should prevail over the lower ones."
Right.
So she changes her prayer.
Exactly. And I imagine her going back up on the roof.
Yeah.
And now she completely reverses her prayer and hopes that the angels win. Yeah, the tug of war. And essentially she's praying that he should die.
Right. And the sages, though, the other rabbis, the students, they would not be silent.
Yeah, but I want to stay for a minute on the difficulty of praying that someone should die. I just think it's both a very it's a bold move. It feels like guilt inducing. It feels like a hard thing to do. I get it. I really do get it. And I imagine that for sure in her time, and I think that's part of the point of the story, it was not seen as the thing to do. It was not seen as okay. You can't pray that someone should die because God forbid that might hasten their death. And when we get to the question of how is this used in medical ethics, we're going to come back to that question. But I think still it's just a really hard thing to do. And the tradition then, after this story, deals with that question. Can you pray that someone should die? Okay.
I would just put out there also that she has a self-interested reason also that he shouldn't die, which is like he's her employer, like maybe she'll lose her job after he dies. So it's not like she and the rabbis are actually in the same position. Like they don't want him to die because it'll be bad for them in terms of he has an important role in their life. But ultimately she sees his humanity in a way that they don't.
Yeah.
So so the sages would not be silent, meaning they would not stop begging for mercy.
Right. So they're pulling on the other end of the rope, keeping Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's soul. And this is also an important part of the text. What it's saying is prayer is efficacious. When you pray that someone should stay alive, it I think the implication here is that it's working. Her prayer that he should die is not working because their prayer that he should stay alive is stronger, and their prayer is keeping him alive. That's interesting all by itself.
Yeah, and is it stronger because there are more of them? Is it stronger because they are the sages, and so they're again, if we look at these things as metaphorical, literary ways, right? These are the powerful people. And you could say prayer is prayer, but you could say like the powerful people have more power than the powerless people. That's our society today. It's getting worse and worse. The consolidation of wealth. Like we know that Jeff Bezos has a lot more power than any of us. Not only not because there's more of him, he's just extremely powerful. And so if I'm coming to, again, we could take this out of the realm of the heavenly. I'm coming to Congress, asking for a certain, or even better, I mean, African Americans are coming to Congress. Trans folk are coming to Congress. Asking for changes to the law or this voting rights stuff that's going on now. But powerful financial interests are on the other side. They're more powerful, and if it's just we say this, we say that, then the more powerful are going to prevail. So
and I don't know if it's more powerful or if it's more numerous. I'm not sure.
Right. I think that's the question, and there's no answer. I mean, we could, but what I'm encouraging is that we do a little bit of translation here to that we can look at these in the simple meaning of the case itself, but we can also see this as and then we could say, well, it's not relevant. I mean, it's relevant in terms of what we're going to talk about with svara, but it's not relevant in terms of the case because we don't really believe that prayer is efficacious in that way anymore. But if we translate this into other realms, then I think we can also see that just as a story, this is actually quite relevant.
And P.S., I'm not sure if we believe, generally speaking, that prayer isn't efficacious.
I'm thinking
When
that's who don't.
yeah, I'll tell you, when someone I love is sick, I'm asking everyone I know to pray for them, and I am too.
Yeah.
So I don't
Yeah.
know what to do with that because it also doesn't fit in with my own theology. I don't think the world works that way, but when you're in a what's it called, the people who are fighting when they're in the foxhole.
Foxhole, yeah. There's no atheists in foxholes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, or it's like Pascal's wager. It doesn't hurt, but
Right.
you know. Okay, so anyway, so it's not working. So she's reversed her prayer. She's up on the roof, having said, no, he's suffering so much. It's time for him to go. Which it's just interesting to just also think about like that we've been talking about. You alluded to this at the beginning, but when we first started talking about some of this stuff, we were talking about pikuach nefesh, the idea of saving a life being the top thing. But then later we looked at texts that were more about the alleviation of suffering. And here we actually see a case where death and suffering are not aligned, and that if that you can live with suffering or die without suffering. And at least in this maidservant calculus is in this end of life situation, it would be better to stop the suffering, which is irreversible, I think in the story here. And so at that point, suffering, either the end of suffering now comes to trump saving a life at all costs, or
That's right.
better yet, I think actually might be that you thought it was about saving a life. No, that was just an application of the greater principle, which is the alleviation of suffering.
Oh, I like that. That.
And that's what I was saying last week or 2 weeks ago, about like you thought it was the written Torah and the oral Torah. No, it's been svara all along. It's just been svara in the form of a written Torah, and svara in the form of an oral Torah. And now maybe in the third era, it's svara abstract. We can have svara live just as svara. And here, we can open our eyes wide enough to see that it's always been about the alleviation of suffering.
Wow, that's beautiful.
So she takes a jug so it's called a kuza, so they're translating that as a jug, and she throws it from the roof to the ground, which ostensibly makes a loud explosive noise, and it startles the sages. And the sages became silent and momentarily ceased praying for mercy, and the soul of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi rested. In other words, he died.
Yeah. I love this image of her going, gosh, my prayer isn't working, that the upper one should win out and Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi should die because all these sages are keeping his soul down here. And she plays dirty.
Yeah.
I love that. She says, okay, how can I get them to stop, let go of the rope so that the angels can win the tug of war? And so she throws down this jug, which makes a noise, and just being startled for a moment, they stop their prayer. And in that instant, her prayer wins out and he dies. I love it. I love the breaking the rules, playing dirty, so that her prayer should win and he should die.
Right. And I think like the tug of war image is helpful there, because it's like there's this constant tug of war. It's exactly even. Which, by the way, well, there's stuff to unpack there about the is it her prayer is equal to those of the sages even before? So it's or I guess not, because he's not like suspended necessarily. They're winning. He's not dying. But then if they stop pulling, boom, the other side wins the tug of war, right? It's
yeah. And the way this text is usually understood. Now you have to know that when you're drawing on the tradition to answer new questions, there's always the subjective element of which texts are you going to draw on? Which texts are you going to choose to create a foundation for your position? So not everyone uses this text and not everyone reads it the same way, but most people who are trying to decide what to do, particularly in the case of end-of-life issues, namely on the question of euthanasia, are using this text to say, oh, wow, this looks like a case where something we're doing is artificially keeping someone alive who the heavens say should be dead. I mean, we've passed the line, in tug of war, there's the line and you got to get the other team across that line. It's like the line of, okay, this is your time has already been crossed for this person. And we're adding something artificial to sustaining this person's life beyond the point at which they quote unquote should have died. And in this case, it's the sages who are praying that is the impediment to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's death beyond the point at which he should have died. And the typical read on this text is, oh, since the handmaiden is not vilified, she's praised for what she did, it must be okay to remove an impediment to death if that impediment is keeping someone alive beyond that line. And I think that's what's typically called passive euthanasia. In other words, unplugging. But as opposed to active euthanasia, which is hastening someone's death, pushing them more quickly to that line by doing something that will cause them to die sooner than they otherwise would have.
Right, like actively giving a lot of morphine or something like that.
Well, morphine actually palliative, the morphine question
but like enough to kill the person.
If your intention is to kill the person. Yeah. It's actually a complicated gray area with morphine because again, I don't, by the way, to everyone, I don't want this to be a medical ethics.
No, don't take any of this as medical advice.
Exactly. Or halachic psak. And I really recommend that anyone read Elliot Dorff's writings on this. But with regard to morphine, what he says is if your intention is to relieve the suffering with the morphine, and it also
causes.
death,
Uh-huh.
that isn't considered
Uh-huh.
active euthanasia. It's a super fuzzy
Uh-huh.
area. Um,
But the bottom line is that this text it most likely doesn't have a lot to say about active euthanasia, but it does say regarding passive euthanasia. I'm not sure that I've heard it called that, or but I mean that basically stopping heroic measures, that that could arguably be seen to be fitting into this paradigm, because the prayer is being translated into those active measures, and so the ceasing of those active measures is. Mhm. Well, what's interesting though, although actually when I think about it, this text, right, she actually is engaging in active measures, the maidservant.
yeah, that's one of the critiques of how this text is typically used. They point to her throwing down the vase as active.
No, I mean it's more that her prayer is the active
Oh,
measure.
her prayer. Uh-huh.
That so that her throwing down the vase is causing the ceasing of the heroic measures. That's clear. And she's done something active, but you're always doing something active. I mean, if you turn
Pulling
off
the plug is inactive.
active, and that has always been that's been an issue in medical ethics as well. But that you could argue, but so that's one category, and that sort of feels like the easy thing to see in this text. And but I think it's also there that she's, by reversing her prayer, if we're taking the prayer to be analogous to the active measure, to the to measures that. And again, like I bring in here too, I appreciate and love your belief in the efficaciousness of prayer, the possibility of it, like, but as somebody who really doesn't, I see this as like very powerful by analogy, and so to say that the analogy here is about medical intervention, and in the same way that we believe in today, and we believe in the efficaciousness of medical intervention, they really believed back then in the efficaciousness of prayer. So it actually is the same. They believe they but anyway, so her active reversal of the prayer and praying that he should die is arguably, I'm not trying to make halachic talks here too, but is arguably analogous to more active measures.
Only if he is understood to be to the right-hand side, meaning past the point at which he, quote unquote, would have naturally died without the intervention. So if he is before that point, and her prayer that he should die is trying to make him die sooner than he would have with no prayer, I think that's active euthanasia. And I think the understanding of this text, based on how it ends, which is that he dies when the sage's prayer is removed, is it? I think the scenario, sort of the fact pattern, is that he's not at that line yet. If it were thought, if he's at that, if he's before that line, for sure her action, her prayer that he should die, would be perceived as hastening his death, and this would be a text justifying active euthanasia. I haven't seen anyone read it that way, although.
Well, I'm not trying to justify or not justify, because really it's not how I kind of make decisions. Whatever. So like everybody watching this should take this with grains of salt, in that I'm not trying to assert anything, but I am trying to read the text the way I read it. I might be, so that I might be the first that you encounter that reads it that way, because like as I'm thinking about it, I feel like she is engaging in an active measure, understanding that analogy. And what I would say, and maybe I think this is where you want to go a little bit on the question of svara, is that I think there's something here about the maidservants. The maidservant is actually powerful and important in this story. Like, she is important because she sees the world as it truly is. She sees his humanity as he truly is. She understands in a way that either they don't or refuse to, that it's actually about alleviation of suffering and not about living, and she understands that that even though his continuing to live would give them and her important value, uh her job, maybe. Also, I assume she feels fondly towards him. There's all kinds of reasons why it's a loss to her that he should die. But at the end of the day, she cuts through all of that. And the fact that she's a woman, the fact that she's a maidservant, and all of these things say, to me that her svara, again, that means her moral capacity to reason and to see the right thing just through her own moral perspective is highly elevated. It's better. She's got the best svara of anyone here. She changes her mind. I mean, the things like, right, so then I look at that story that way and say, well, so actually maybe her plus, it's not just that she made them stop the prayer and that allowed the angels to be stronger. It's the angels plus her was enough to pull him over once they stopped pulling for a moment. And maybe if she hadn't been one of the ones pulling in the other direction, their momentary stopping of the prayer wouldn't have quite been enough. And the angels wouldn't have gotten them over and they would have pulled back, and somehow so like, I want to like play that like she actually really, everything she does in this story is critical, including the active measure. That's again, I think the story reads perfectly beautiful and fine without that, and it's still, all the svara is still there. But I would at least suggest the reading that she's actually engaging in an active measure here.
I think that's beautiful. And you know what you brought up for me as you're describing her and her svara is the issue of how much learning do you need to consider your svara and not just what I feel like doing. And in the early days when I would talk about svara, I would hear my students saying, well, that means I can do anything. And I was like, whoa, is that what wait a minute. And then I really always was careful to say the rabbis link learning, being gamirna, and having svara, being savirna. And you can't use your svara unless you've got some amount of learning. And, it used to be a very little amount. They talk about knowing your Mishnahs backward and forward. That was it. And I don't quite know how much learning you need to be a player, but I love you're pointing out she probably has no learning. I mean, I don't think she's because
she's a woman and she's a maidservant.
Exactly.
Even if there are a couple of women in the Talmud that have some learning, but probably not maidservants.
Probably, exactly. So here's an example of svara playing out, being lauded with no learning attached. That's really interesting, and I never noticed that in this text.
Well, I would say let's not call it no learning. Let's call it a different learning. And that's something that I think is really significant in our time too. Although it's a little different. So her learning is the learning at his bedside. I mean, it's the learning. In other words, like it's learning, maybe the wrong word, but it's we call it life experience. I mean, so they have learning. The rabbis have learning, but they don't know him. She may not have the learning, but she knows him, and at this time, at this particular case, her svara is at least equal to their svara, and it may be not greater than, because they have to stop for a second before she can prevail, but it's not nothing. And so don't say she can't do, so it's not your student saying, oh, I can do anything, but it's saying, but you also can't do nothing. There are some things so it's a question of like calculating where the liberties are that you can take based on the svara that you do have, and is that applicable to this particular case in question? And this case could be seen as narrowly as one man's death, parenthetical, it's the most important man in the world at this moment, or it can be seen more globally as about end of life death, right? So we might say like end of life doulas have enough svara today to be able to apply that svara to any death, that there's right, and maybe even beyond. You could say, well, no, what we're seeing in the stories is she has so much svara that apparently she could even decide if something's kosher. Like I don't think the story supports that, but you could argue. What the reason I say all that is to apply that to today is that I've been trying to kind of tease out this thought that, let's say that there's a person in the world who doesn't have a lot of learning, but some of those people are doctors, a professor of literature, a lawyer who's done trust and estates things, and I mean, you're telling me that these people have insufficient svara, moral intuition, compared to some kid that just graduated from rabbinical school? Like, come on, so you're telling me that the kid that just graduated from rabbinical school can decide on, an end of life subject, but like the doctor who's been doing it for 45 years cannot, Jewishly. That doesn't seem right. So somehow I think what this story is suggesting is that it's not there's not a moment where you like get your svara and now you're svared. It's like it's contextual. There's lots of ways to look at it, and it's not all or nothing.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and I really appreciate the expansion of the idea of what learning really is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think about Richard Elliott Friedman, who is on another program like this on Jewish Live, and he talks about Sigmund Freud wrote Moses and Monotheism, and he had these theories that like Akhenaten, who was this king of Egypt, who was a monotheist, and that was really kind of the origin of Moses stuff and whatever. There's all kinds of theories like this, and he said like there are certain scholars who say Freud didn't know anything, like he wasn't a scholar of Bible and Judaism, and like what does he know? And they just sort of just utterly dismissive of anything that Freud has to say about the Bible. And Richard Elliott Friedman, who's like one of the greatest scholars of Bible, and he really tends to also be kind of not a fan of amateurs. He says, but look, this is Freud. This is Sigmund Freud. Like he's one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century. Like or the 19th, whatever, whatever, the 20th. So like I'm going to be dismissive of Sigmund Freud. Like, my impulse is that if Sigmund Freud says something, I'm at least going to give it a second read, and I think that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But here she's like the Sigmund Freud of this particular case. Actually, there's in law, there's this idea of like the law of the case. It's kind of like a narrow, I'm not 100% sure that I remember exactly how to define it, but like sometimes the law is the law for the whole country and all time. And sometimes it's like the law that applies to this particular circumstance. And in this circumstance, I think something here is saying like the attendant to this human being is the wisest person in this case, and we should, and at least of equal value.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're out of time. But is there anything else you want to really say about this svara here?
No. I think you've said it all. I think for me, this story raises up the question of who's in our community, who can be in our community, and whose svara should we be listening to? And I think the answer is much broader on all of those questions than we typically think. And she changed the entire tradition. She changed how we think about prayer and life and suffering and our role vis-a-vis God, and what should happen in the world. Because we listened to her svara.
Yeah, and I think it's just important to note that this story was preserved in the Talmud. I mean, what that means is that the rabbis, they didn't have to keep this story in, so in other words, they're agreeing with the way. This is not an anti-nomial, anti-clerical perspective. This is what the rabbis end up saying, was that actually it's the svara of, quote, the common person that does matter, maybe not in all cases, but don't dismiss it. It's and this is one of the most important figures in the whole Talmud, right? So this is not just some side case. Like this is, and it was a normal, regular woman, maidservant, who determines the outcome, and they preserve that with a positive balance. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was a great text. Exciting. Okay, so to be continued. We are excited. We'll be back next week. Our show will be pre-recorded next week, so doesn't really affect you folks watching, but just know that it won't actually be live when you're watching it, even if you watch it at the regular time. But it'll go up at the regular time, and we will be back live the following week. So we'll see you then.
Great. Bye, Dan.
Bye.